Welcome, everyone. Can folks hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. So welcome to the OpenZFS leadership meeting. We're going to be having a 1-hour meeting today. I know the reminder that I sent out still had the 30-minute time on it, but as we discussed last meeting, we're going to go for an hour today. I apologize if anybody needs to drop off after the half an hour. So there are a bunch of interesting things to talk about in the agenda. So there's kind of 3 categories I think that we can talk about today. One is continuing to talk about the ideas from the spreadsheet, the projects from the spreadsheet, and who's going to own porting them to the different platforms. The other is kind of continuing the discussion that we started last time about kind of the big picture of porting, and if we want to be doing things kind of piecemeal, project by project, versus like trying to take every change in order, from Linux to the other platforms. And then the third is there are a bunch of interesting topics that were brought up and put onto the agenda in the past month, including one that I think would be interesting to discuss today is the default tool features to enable. This is brought up on the mailing list by, I think, someone named Rich, no last name given. I don't know are you on the call by any chance? Okay, I'll assume not. But I think that he brought up some good points, even though I kind of disagree with his overall suggestion. I think that it's definitely a worthwhile problem to try to address. So I think we could discuss that among the other ideas that were on the agenda. So since we have an hour, we probably have time, I think, to do most of these. Do folks, I guess maybe the more contentious one might be the high-level picture of how we want to do porting from between the various platforms. So why don't we start off with that? If folks have opinions, or if it's kind of still status quo, same as last meeting, then we can kind of skip that and go on to the particular features. So I'll open the floor to folks who want to discuss, like, if we should even be talking about each individual feature versus if we should be focusing more on how to get like every commit onto every platform and what the process is for that.
My vote would be for the latter. It strikes me as a much more complicated thing to do.
So it's more, I think that's Sean, you're saying you would rather that we do every commit at a time, but it's more complicated to do that.
In terms, no, sorry, I understood your statement to be, I would rather we discuss how we're going to keep all the various platforms in sync rather than discuss each individual feature, because that is a much more complicated task, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that it's more complicated, mostly it's more complicated to do. It takes more work to do. I don't know how much discussion we need to, I think it's a lot of hard work to just go back through and look at like every commit from Linux and FreeBSD, and hey, do we have that on Illumos, for example? Or, Sean, I think you're coming from FreeBSD, so go back and look at every commit from Linux, and do we have that on FreeBSD? If not, then do the port, resolve all the conflicts. I think that's, if somebody's going to step up to do that work, then that's great. And I think then we can kind of track this progress, more chronologically versus feature-wise.
I think for Illumos, where at least in the work that we're doing at Joyent, we're looking at seeing it as a diff minimization effort rather than the path-dependent approach where you sort of look at all the commits that have happened and try to keep up with each one of those. Mm-hmm. I think that's why we're interested in picking like a ZFS on Linux release like 0.80 if that gets stabilized or whatever, and then really just because it's actually because there's no clear upstream, it's pretty hard even to see which commits make sense. Like there's not necessarily, like it's not a simple linear history problem anymore, really, because you've got all these different trains in each of the other OSs. So we're probably going to look at pick a specific state of the ZOL tree, and then our current Illumos gate state, and do a big diff against that, and then try and just the moral equivalent of getting a highlighter and trying to start to well, these parts seem like they're related, and we might not end up pulling the structure and commit for commit. We might end up creating bugs on our own side where we pull in, say, 20 different commits because we think that they're all related.
Right.
We'll test them in one go. But the goal is definitely going to be to make the diff as small as it makes sense to make it, at which point we'll have everything. So I think that's still what we're gearing up to do. So.
Okay. So in that case, it sounds like prominent folks from Illumos and FreeBSD are interested in doing it that way, or differently than just taking each project the way that I'd kind of been going through the feature matrix. So it sounds like maybe we should. I think it's still worth continuing to track what features are available on what platforms using the spreadsheet, but it might not be as useful, as good of a use of our time to kind of go over each one of those and try to assign an owner, since it's not. We probably won't have a different person owning each of these smaller projects.
Sorry, probably one idea about some release engineering. It's if we have some different projects, we need to know the states of ZFS between different platforms. Yes, and for some management, the same components on different projects, we need to know probably some label or tag, and how it compare with the same code and components in other platform. A primary issue at this moment, it is different features and some different code base between platforms, Illumos, Linux, FreeBSD, and a first step probably it can be try to synchronize a feature set if it is possible. If it is impossible, try to identify the same feature between different platforms and probably organize step by step of synchronization of these features between platforms and organize automation testing of this feature on different platforms. We used this logic on Motorola project where we do some integration on different platforms where we can identify different components. I think we can try probably split some feature set and synchronize at first time between platforms what features are the same and what features are different, and probably try to identify a time where some features can be ported to different platforms. It is some idea probably for some different cases.
I'm not sure I followed all of that, but it sounds like am I correct that one kind of thing that you're proposing is something like the feature matrix spreadsheet, but also with an additional layer of granularity of particular releases of, for example, Linux, ZFS on Linux, and of FreeBSD, so that you could tell, for example, device removal is in this version of Linux and this version of Illumos, and then maybe each separate addition to device removal is available in, or enhancement to device removal is available, and this release of this platform.
Yes, yes, it's probably a good example where one feature was integrated to Lumos but not integrated to some other platforms, Linux and FreeBSD. The same issue with stream support probably, and some another differences between Linux, Illumos, and FreeBSD, because Linux have some another implementation of some additional features what are not available on Illumos. And probably in one point, we need to try to identify a full list of features what are available on all platforms and identify additions what are available on other platforms and try to identify what we need for synchronize a list of features between different platforms.
Yeah, so I think that the end goal that you're describing is kind of the same end goal that we're all talking about now. And it sounds like you're suggesting that we have a more detailed document than the feature matrix spreadsheet to track that work, in more detail than just like device removal as one thing, but to track
Yes.
the subsequent commits that enhance that.
My one issue. Go ahead, Argo. Go.
Sorry, probably some additional point for it. It is probably we need to provide a tag or label what feature available on some platform. For example, if device removal available on Illumos, we need to identify this change set and mark it as tag or label, and it will be probably start point for next platform and other platforms where they can take a look commits start point for ports of features, because time to time it probably hardly identify where is the start point for some features, because some features can be depend on some other features.
Yeah, so it sounds like the problem that you're trying to solve there is like, if I'm trying to port device removal, for example, and there were 20 commits that were part of device removal in Illumos, and I need to find all 20 of those, it's like hard to find like, okay, where do I start with this, and then what are all the other commits that I need? So I think the question of how to do that is like, where do those tags live? Like, what does this tagging thing look like? I think that probably the simplest way to do it would be to say that when we do commits, part of the commit message should include like a line that says basically this commit is a follow-on to this previous commit. So like, this is I'm enhancing device removal. So I would add some tag that says, relates to or depends on, or something like that says, it depends on this earlier commit. And then that would let you basically build like this dependency graph of like logical dependencies between the different commits.
So
go ahead, Zeph.
Okay, so my question is, and this gets to basically an existential question about this. Are we trying to be a single project that has many different ports to environments, or are we trying to be a coordinated group of implementations?
That's a good question to have. Like, the way I've been seeing it so far is that it's more of the latter, where we're just a loosely organized, coordinated-ish group of implementations that all seem to actually govern themselves relatively, actually quite differently. So if we're actually supposed to be one big project as opposed to just in a confederation of smaller projects, then maybe we need to think about how we're organized to reflect that better.
I think the dream, is for all of us to have, for all of us to be one project, and like in a completely ideal world that, where we'd thought about all of this stuff 10 years ago or whatever, basically, ideally we would have one project that compiles against everything. but getting there is going to be really kind of difficult. And my one issue that I wanted to bring up with trying to port features and trying to manage things on a feature by feature basis is that seems to work well, or that seems like it might work really well for features, but there's a lot of like bug fixes and stuff that I think that will not work very well for. So for instance, a while ago I was working on an issue where that was specifically related to, and there have been a bunch of these, but related to raw sends and large D nodes. So and it's kind of tricky to start coordinating these when you get like bug fixes, which kind of live in between features. And in that particular instance, you could say, well, it just you tag it as large D nodes and you tag it as this other thing. But what if as part of large D nodes or something, we refactored something that wasn't really related, and then now the code doesn't match up, and and it's a nightmare to port. I understand wanting to do it feature by feature because that seems to break it up into much more manageable pieces. But I also kind of foresee that we're going to have some kinds of a bunch of issues when if we try to go forward like that.
I think a primary issue there is how platforms are different and how hard to port new features from platform to platform.
I think there's a fundamental impedance mismatch in development philosophy between Illumos and FreeBSD and Linux. The ZFS on Linux port got 6 commits just in the last couple hours. Their velocity is a lot higher than FreeBSD's or Illumos's. And I think any attempts to rein that velocity in are going to fail. I don't think it's possible to get an integrated FreeBSD and Illumos and ZFS and Linux port, because Linux is just going to go, cool story, bro. We did some stuff. Take it or leave it, and that's just how they work. It's not a bad thing or good thing. It's just fundamentally different.
I
think.
Can I jump in here and give some opinions on this?
Yep.
And I apologize for interrupting. We will get to let everyone say their opinions on it. So let me first just get back to Sean's original question about are we a bunch of related projects or are we one project? I think that is a spectrum, right? It's not. I don't think that we're ever going to be 100% of one or the other. I think that my goal for the group is that we try to move towards being one project. We're all working with very similar code bases, basically identical concepts, and I think that we benefit a lot from coordinating our work and from making sure that our work is available to everyone who's using ZFS. I think that folks don't want to see an ideological separation of ZFS on Linux versus ZFS on Lumos versus ZFS on FreeBSD. And I think that applies both to developers and even more so to end users who want to be able to bring their pools and their skill sets and their admin skills from one platform to another, right? If I know how to administer and use ZFS really well on FreeBSD, I want to be able to go find a job where I'm using and administering ZFS on Illumos or Linux as well. So I think that there's definitely a big incentive on thinking on that goal of one project. Now the reality is there are three different major code bases, and even more when we get to talking about Mac OS and Windows, and so that are part of three different projects that are managed separately with different politics and different velocities. So kind of getting to the last point that was made about the impedance mismatch, I think that I agree and acknowledge that the rate of change of commits is different on the different platforms, but I disagree with the assessment that ZFS on Linux is kind of doing its own thing without regard for what is good for other platforms. I think that the difficulty is that like there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of change requests, and there is a lot of velocity there. So in order for the ZFS and Linux project to take into account what's good for other platforms, we need to know what's good for them. We need people from those platforms to show up and say, like, hey, like we need to slow down on this review, like it's not ready, or like it doesn't work well, it's not going to work well on FreeBSD, so we need to rethink it, or to educate the folks who are kind of in charge of the ZFS and Linux project, like me and Brian and other prominent folks, to educate us that hey, this type of change doesn't work well. You need to like this type of change doesn't work well on Illumos. You need to check with us or like rethink it so that we can alert folks from those platforms about those changes before they go in. So I think that there's work that needs to be done, but I think that like ZFS on Linux does not want to be the wild, wild west where anything goes and like you can take whatever broken software arrives there. Like that is absolutely not the goal. The goal is to be have the same standard of quality that Illumos and shipping FreeBSD releases have, but we're going to fall, like we fall short, right? And I know all the platforms have fall short, and especially if you're talking about FreeBSD master or ZFS and Linux master, like there's bugs there sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't compile. Like things are not perfect, but I think that we all kind of we're all coming from a similar goal, and we need to help each other to achieve that goal. Now, I know that's a lot of like mom and apple pie kind of talk, so I'll cede the floor to other folks who want to offer their perhaps counterpoints or counter opinions to that.
I mean, Matt, it's honestly kind of refreshing hearing that coming from you. I actually didn't know that you were heading up part of the ZFS on Linux project. I mean, in my experience in the past, it always seemed like ZOL was kind of lagging behind other implementations. So it's good to see a lot of rapid development on that end. But I just want to say, like, it's really good to hear that you don't want to take the Linux approach to things. And I mean, I should know that coming from you, because I mean, in my experience, a lot of stuff on Linux is very much screw everybody else. We're doing our own thing. We're going to do as quickly as possible, and the heck with bugs, the heck with stability, the heck with other platforms. So knowing that ZOL is kind of sticking to that old school ethos of like, let's make sure that things are working. Let's make sure stuff is shipping out and it's stable. That kind of sets my mind at ease, because I've been real concerned over like the last, I don't know, about year, seeing a lot of the ZOL progress and hearing a lot of talk about let's make ZOL sort of the upstream source of truth. That had me worried for a while. So let's worried now. I just want to pop in and say that.
Well, I'd like to jump out there and say that we absolutely do care a lot about quality in ZOL. We've set up a lot of testing infrastructure, and I think we do bring that ethos of we don't want to put anything ever in the tree that is buggy. So I like to try and dispel that myth a little bit from the other ports that we do want to fix bugs.
I wasn't like assuming that you guys were going to do it that way. I didn't know who was actually running the ZOL project, and I was like, Linux. Ugh. I mean,
well,
what's happening?
Come on.
So Linux is unstable or willing to commit broken stuff, because I think the code quality of Linux, especially recently, where recently is the last 5 to 10 years, is pretty high. The quality of project is high, the stability of Linux is high, and what my point would be is, I think that FreeBSD is far more concerned with making sure things work on Linux than Linux is concerned with making sure things work on FreeBSD.
Yeah.
That's definitely been my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just going to jump in just a little bit because while I'm a little bit of a newcomer here, I've been working with Brian and other members of ZOL to improve the stability and whatnot. I don't think it's quite a fair characterization to say that like we're just trying, like as a whole with the Linux platforms, that we're changing things for the sake of change. I think it's more about we're adapting to a larger variety of different problems and solutions that we have to come up with, and things just get way more complicated. We have to deal with it a lot more quickly because of the broader base of people using it. That doesn't mean that we don't care about, say, FreeBSD or Lumos or any other operating system platform that wants to use ZFS, but from our perspective, at least from my work with the ZOL test infrastructure, it's not like sure, it'd be great if we were testing other platforms, but it doesn't make a lot of sense because the infrastructure for building an OS agnostic ZFS just doesn't exist. If it did, maybe we could actually say, all right, let's test to see whether this feature makes sense on all the different OSs. But for now, we don't have that. So, I mean, it's not that we're trying to go faster than everyone else or, break all the things or anything like that. And I have some suspicions of where that particular concern is coming from, but that's for a different point. But I think we're trying really hard to be able to address everyone and move things forward faster while maintaining a high level of quality across the board. I mean, we're simultaneously handling both the Linux kernel commit and style standards as well as the Illumos ones, and that's a hard thing to by itself. That particular bit is difficult enough to satisfy. There's a whole lot of things that goes into the ZFS testing and quality assurance that we try to do on every commit that goes not even into the code base, but being proposed into the code base. So I think that it's unfair to consider that it is that we're just screwing up everyone.
I think I would like to say that I think it's probably pretty critically important that we don't turn this call into a referendum on people's choices of operating system. I think that obviously.
I think that's what it's turning. I think it's turning into like a referendum on like ZFS on those platforms, right? I think hopefully we're all talking ZFS on Linux and ZFS on FreeBSD and not Linux versus FreeBSD.
Yeah,
right. I think some of the perceptions that maybe we've been talking about are about perhaps less directly related to the ZFS effort, is my point. And I think we are all...
I hope people are talking about their perceptions of ZFS on Linux being the wild, wild west rather than Linux, right? Like, hopefully folks know that ZFS on Linux and Linux are like...
fundamentally separate.
Two different things, two different projects, completely disjoint sets of people and philosophies.
So let me close the loop on that since I brought this up. I don't think that there's a problem with the difference in development methodologies at all. I think ignoring that problem exists or that impedance mismatch exists, I shouldn't even call it a problem, is bound to cause problems in of itself. I think that to maintain compatibility between the platforms, you should focus on features. Because I think things aren't going to sit on the ZFS on Linux to-do list for 3 years while people contemplate how they're going to do that. Or we should do that someday, or that sure would be nice to have. It's just going to happen. And Neil, was that your point? To your point, they're going to try as hard as possible to make sure there's compatibility and they're not going out of their way to break things and going out of their way to change things just for the sake of changing it. I don't think anybody is interested in doing that. But at the end of the day, they're not Illumos experts. They're not experts.
And that's the point that I was trying to make.
Yes, because we have a Lumos code base first, and it was ported to some other platform. It was why Lumos process in first probably, and the issue for others. I think if we can change integration process, it will be much more better for other platforms. And probably for some other platforms, we have to add some platform-specific definition for enable or disable some feature sets between different platforms.
Yeah, and like my personal holy grail would be that it'd be possible to do an OS agnostic ZFS build and be able to test the baseline code all by itself, operating in user space and stuff. But, that's probably never going to happen. But I can still hope and dream.
I mean, that would be an ideal situation, having, sort of splitting things out so that there's a single universal OS agnostic, giant ZFS, OpenZFS project, and then, just nudging things individually. I mean, obviously I'm not a ZFS developer. I like ZFS and I've written some crappy tools around it, but I'm not a ZFS developer. So I keep meaning to dig into the code base, and maybe I'm already describing a large portion of what's already occurred. But I mean, just from, a complete outsider's perspective, as, someone who hasn't touched the code base yet, keeps meaning to, having like a single universal source of truth, and then I guess like shim layers to adjust to, individual behavior on individual operating systems. If that's not what we're already doing, it may be worth considering that as, something to look at as sort of an end goal, so that there isn't a concern about, ZFS on Linux is like doing all this stuff and everybody's getting left behind, or, ZFS on FreeBSD isn't moving quickly enough, or does anyone even still run Illumos? I love Solaris, I love Illumos, don't get me wrong.
I'm going to raise Matt's hand for him right now, because
can I just jump in and say, that would be, I agree, that would be an ideal state of the world. It's just, we're pretty far off from being able to achieve that technically. And I think, we're talking about undertaking some pretty big amounts of work here, just to, get all the source code like more aligned than it is now. So, if folks feel like we should be taking on that degree of work, like, I'm all for it. But I also want to keep I want to keep us down to earth in terms of what's actually achievable. And I think having like a one repo that's the source of truth that everybody else is pulling from is that would be nice. I think that we should try to get in that direction. We should try to get our source code to be more similar than it is now. We should try to get our integration processes so that everyone is involved in things getting proving stuff to be integrated. And maybe once we get closer to that, then we could think about having a repo that's actually independently buildable and testable, and you can run it all in userland on any platform. But I think that's a whole other project that would be very considerable to undertake.
I'm more saying it as like an ideal and like something to, strive for, as a, maybe a stretch goal. Like we're talking 10, 15, 20 years out, not something that's going to happen, next week. I mean,
whoa! I don't think it'd take that long, but
I'm being very conservative in my estimates. But I mean, I'm saying more as like sort of a guiding principle, as something to move towards over, slowly over time, not as like a primary goal for like, okay, we want to have this by, this time, 5 years from now as a 100% definite, but as, keeping it in mind as we develop and as we move in that direction towards a unified code base, I think that's more what I'm suggesting, an ideal, not necessarily a 100% definite goal.
I think we all agree on like where we want to be, but I think the question is, how do we get there? And I think so far the two big proposals that we've had so far are either move features over kind of one at a time, and we have on each system there is somebody responsible for each feature, and the other one is again trying to like say, okay, here's the current difference between Illumos and Linux, or FreeBSD and Illumos, or whatever, and trying to resolve those differences.
So
that's useless there.
I want to bring this discussion to a close so that we can move on to other items. But let me first, I want to hear from two more folks first. Josh, had hands up, and then I'd like to hear from Brian Beldorf if you have any concluding remarks on this discussion.
Very briefly, I think I think there are a number of reasons why it's unlikely that we're going to end up with a single source base. I think anytime soon, possibly ever. What I think we're most interested in the Illumos world, because we're probably always going to be a little bit diverse. I think anyway, we're interested in design review, basically. Like if if we're going to add flags to the zpool command, the ZFS command, things like that, user visible surface areas. Like by way of example, I think that zpool create on Linux can take an A shift option, but I think that it probably would have been better, at least for us, for it to be able to take like a forced block size option instead. And we would, because the A shift would then remain like an implementation detail, that sort of stuff. So like you could say block size 4K rather than A shift 12. I think, yeah, and decisions like that. And so like, you know, I've been hanging out in the Slack to try and help out where I can with those decisions. If there are other venues that we should be participating in to try and get earlier visibility into bigger, particularly user visible interface sort of changes, then we would like to do that too. And I think that that's the area where we're going to be able to most cheaply and most quickly get involved in that process of decision making, rather than, whereas right now obviously we're quite far behind on syncing up, so it's harder for us to like take each patch and test it or whatever. But
we need some agreements in some flags, some feature flags between different platforms. If we have some agreements about flags, one platform implement a shift, another platform by block size or something else, we need some agreements between platforms, and probably try to switch to use some known, understandable, and more feature flags and command flags if needed. We need to try to specify the flags and try to discuss agreements between platforms and implements.
Yeah, so I think I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is not really platform specific, and I think that if I could kind of up level it a little bit, I would say we need to make sure that we have the best people available reviewing changes to ZFS on regardless of the platform that those changes are originally being made on. So like, you know, Josh, I happen to agree with you of your views of whether it should have been called A shift, but like, for example, it would have been great if Josh knew about this change to add this A shift flag when it was being made and could have, you know, offered his opinion on it at the time, and the relevant folks would have taken that into account, and you know, we all could have had a discussion about it and come to a conclusion. I don't think that I think that it isn't like, oh, is it the Illumos way or the ZFS on Linux way? It's just a matter of like, we're all using ZFS and we all want ZFS to work like the best way possible, and we want to make sure that our opinion of the best way is heard and considered by everybody at the time the change is being made.
Because we're gonna take the A shift option basically, like, and it's fine. It's just that, so that like we do absolutely want to be consistent with all of the implementations, and for that to be easier to achieve, we would just like to make sure that it makes sense for us too, basically.
Yeah, I think raising the visibility of any kind of user interface changes would definitely help us to do that.
That's right.
And
yes, I completely agree with all that.
You would get the last. Well, I said that Brian would get the last word on this overall. So I'd like to kind of hold off further discussion on this so that we have a little bit of time for more specific things. One of which I think will be pretty relevant to this, and kind of let Brian have a couple of words about kind of what your thoughts are, since you are kind of the de facto leader of ZFS on Linux. And I think folks would like to hear from you on a bunch of topics here.
Yeah, so I agree with most of what's been said, actually. I think I completely agree with where we want to be. It would be really nice to have a platform, but it's a long ways off. As for the features that have been talked about and reviewed, yeah, we've merged a lot of things for Linux to add new features that we probably should have gotten more input from. But conversely, we've pulled a lot of things from Illumos or FreeBSD that we look at and say, ooh, I wish you hadn't done it that way. So I completely sympathize with the comments about you know, getting people from all the platforms to review any changes. I think that's really important going forward. I'd like to also throw out there that we were behind for a long time on Linux between all the other platforms, and we found that a good way to catch up, while painful, was systematically going through all the commits. It really does take a lot of work and effort, but I mean, we found that everyone we pulled from other platforms, we had to make platform-specific changes to, right? We'd look at it, we'd evaluate in the context of Linux, and get it merged. So it was systematic, and it was slow, but we did get there eventually. I'm not sure pulling things in with features is going to work out too well. So those are just my quick thoughts.
Okay, and I think if all flags and features will be publicly available, we can try to evaluate first between platforms and have some agreements between platforms. Why some features and flags available on different platforms? Because they are not available publicly for discussion. My point of view.
I didn't quite follow that.
Yeah.
That there's some private discussion happening that you'd like to be public?
I mean, we need on OpenZFS site try to specify all flags and feature flags in command line tool like zpool, ZFS commands, and try to discuss those flags for all platforms. And all platforms guys can say agree or disagree, and probably we need some agreements for flags, for tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes to what we've been saying, that changes that affect the user interface need to be reviewed by everyone who has informed input, and that's going to come from all the different platforms. So I think raising the visibility, I think it's a great idea that we should raise the visibility of changes that would impact the user interface and make sure that those are known and reviewed by folks on each platform. So in terms of how to actually do that, maybe the simplest way would be to say, hey, when we're adding a new flag or changing the user interface, post a message to the OpenZFS developer mailing list. And I think that could be part of the review process. Like when somebody posts a ZFS on Linux pull request, we should say, hey, you're changing the user interface. Let's make sure that we get this reviewed by the broader OpenZFS community. So, just send a message to the OpenZFS mailing list. And by kind of constraining it to just those things that are, not every single bug fix needs to go there, but the things that impact the user interface or the undisc format, I think making sure those have the widest discussion in visibility is great.
Because those are the artifacts that we can't disagree on, basically.
We can't change them after the fact, or it's very difficult.
And like all of the implementation in the middle, we could have totally different code bases, but still be compatible up and down, and everything else would be fine. So I think that's the stuff that and if you were to ping the mailing list with things like that, we would definitely like to get involved.
Yeah. So I think, I'll go ahead and make that proposal and say, hey, let's try to do that. I'll send out, some messages to the mailing list, kind of proposing this more formally, since, this is not supposed to be a meeting where we necessarily make decisions for all of the entire community, since not everyone is able to attend this. But I think if folks here agree, then I'll send it out as a proposal for how we work going forwards.
Hey, Matt, just to let you know that we have 15 minutes left.
Thank you. So,
sorry I asked such a complicated question.
No, I mean, it's a very good question, and I'm glad that we folks have the opportunity to discuss this. We all need to be kind of on the same page with respect to these high-level things in order to, I think, make good progress on the more detailed stuff. And having that shared context of like, ZFS on Linux isn't just trying to be its own thing. That's important for being able to work well together. And the point of the OpenZFS organization and this meeting being part of it is to get folks on the same page, and to bring together the folks who know about ZFS and make sure that we're all like making ZFS the best it can be on every platform. So that's really the point of the organization. So I'd like to change gears a little bit and look at some of the agenda items from the document. I'd like to jump to one that I know was just put there recently, but I think is very relevant to the previous discussion, which is about default pool features to enable. So I mentioned this at the beginning of the meeting. Rich brought this up on the mailing list. To kind of summarize for folks that didn't see that discussion, he was bringing up the point that a lot of folks, I guess he's seen a lot of people that have problems where they have created a ZFS storage pool on one platform, and then they want to bring that pool to another platform, and they aren't able to because it's using some feature flag that isn't available on that platform. So this, I think, he had some specific proposals of how to fix that, which I think are up for discussion. But I think that the overall point of we're making it really easy for folks to shoot themselves in the foot with respect to cross-platform compatibility, and we should try to do better about that. Is definitely a valid point, and we should think about how to address that. I think there's kind of a broad range from kind of most conservative to most radical. The most conservative approach that I think probably most folks could agree is a good idea would be to have like an option when you do zpool create. That's like zpool create -- compat or compatibility equals, and then you could fill in like FreeBSD 10, comma ZOL 0.7.3, comma Illumos, whatever. I see heads are being shaken the wrong way. We'll get to that. I think that is, I think that's an incremental approach, and it's pretty specific about what it lets you do. At kind of the other end of the spectrum, which is what Rich was proposing, was basically like when you create a pool, by default, no features should be enabled. Therefore, you have maximum compatibility, and it's up to everyone to enable features as they want. I'm not a big fan of that because it means that folks will be using, I think generally we're speaking about making ZFS good for folks who don't necessarily know about all the details. And I would like those folks to be able to, at least at some point in some way, take advantage of on-disk feature changes. So like, for example, if we took that kind of hardline approach, then nobody would, the vast majority of people would not be using LZ4 today because that's an extra feature you have to enable. When you do compression equals on, we would have to still default it to whatever they have enabled, which would not be LZ4. And I think that there's a lot of benefit by allowing those kind of changes to at least eventually at some point become the default.
But how to identify Illumos versions for compatibility?
I think that's a great question. I think that how we identify the versions is a big open question, and I think what the defaults are is also an open question. So you could imagine that maybe the default should continue to be all features are enabled. Maybe the default should be features that are available on all platforms when this release was made should be enabled. Maybe it's features that have been on all platforms for 1 year should be enabled. I think there's a lot of range for discussion there, and I guess I'll open the floor to folks' opinions on this.
Since I was shaking my head so rapidly, listing every operating system and version is a horrible, 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 non-scalable idea. If you're going to do that sort of thing, I would instead recommend you come up with years and quarters. In 2018 Q2, all the ones we care about had these features. You can enable those. That would require some active interaction with all of the players to be able to determine what those features were for those timestamps.
So you're effectively describing a compatibility lowest common denominator set at each quarter.
Yes.
And Sean,
that seems somewhat more doable than the other thing.
In particular releases. So, and Sean, would you recommend then that be based on like what's in master essentially? So like, supported on FreeBSD equals whatever's in FreeBSD master, whether it's part of a release or not?
Yes, or actually for FreeBSD, I'd say the stable release, but the FreeBSD people could discuss that and we could say, these are the things we support for this tag, essentially. Does that make sense?
Sure, so like there would just be one FreeBSD tag and the FreeBSD folks would decide, okay, like as of this date, the FreeBSD tag has these features because this release or repo or whatever supports that.
That seems reasonable to me. I'd like to hear what other people thought about that.
I think treating that as kind of a minimum of what we would do, like that sounds great to me. And if having every single release being listed is too much, then I think that's reasonable as well.
At least from the Linux.
Yeah, I see. That's how things operate on the Linux perspective. Once we tag a release and put it out there, we're not going to add any new features to it, right, until we put out a new major release. So it's kind of in our policy.
Yeah, so in the Linux side, it's already operating this way. The only complication is really some of the downstream, the downstream situation for ZOL makes things a little tricky. But from a perspective of saying, like, these are the defaults that you expect when you're talking about what we release in ZOL, then I think that's workable because as long as we're not trying to incorporate downstream information, it becomes a relatively simple matrix.
When you say downstream, do you mean the people that are shipping like binary builds of OpenZFS in their distribution? Or?
The people that ship mangled builds of ZFS into their kernel trees or into their distribution as binaries,
like a Ubuntu release or whatever.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're
Linux distributions.
Yeah. So like most prominently with Ubuntu, like just from from my personal experience of bashing my head into the ground with it, is that the kernel and user space utilities are out of sync. So you cannot expect that the feature set will actually exactly match from the user space tools that are shipped versus the kernel space code that's bundled into their kernel images.
I haven't seen that, but
well, it's not out of sync to the set extent that you'll really notice it. Like it's not like they're bumping like a feature set or two or something like a feature version, but like for example. The kernel tree might be shipping 07. So like let's say for example 076 was what shipped in the user space utilities, and that's what went out in GA in the kernel tree for that release. But if it was a long-term release, like going forward, the kernel software will move forward maybe a little bit occasionally. Maybe there'll be cherry picks or backports or whatnot, but the user space utilities never get updated, for example. So that gets a little tricky when it comes to figuring out what's actually supported and activated.
So in the 5 minutes that we have left, can I ask? I'm sorry I interrupted you there. Can I ask folks on the more controversial issue of what the default should be when you create a pool? Do you think that the default should continue to be everything enabled? Should it be some things are enabled based on what's available at this date, and that kind of changes over time, or nothing is enabled, or something in between?
So I think that the primary thing that both like the users, or mostly that the users are going to be concerned with is, can I get, you're either in the camp of I want to be able to move this to another platform or not. And so if we have like a compatibility mode, I think all that they really care about is not necessarily which version they're compatible to, but I think it's, can we get a version on the Lumos or FreeBSD or Linux or whatever it may be that's compatible with that version. As for default, I think we want most people to, with new pools, I think the people who don't care probably aren't the ones who are going to move.
Right.
So I think that by default, having all of the features enabled would be a good thing, because like, so for instance, like async destroy is a really big feature, and before we had that enabled here at our company, that like was a miss, and not having that enabled. And once we had it enabled, it was great, and lots of our problems went away. So I think doing features by default is probably what we want to do. And for the people who are more aware of the fact that they may be moving, I think we should make it a flag that's available to them for that. And again, I think that I don't think we need to be listing out versions or doing anything like that. I think the idea should just be, at the time that we're making this release, is there a release on the other operating systems that is compatible, or that contains this feature, and that will determine whether that feature gets turned on.
I'd like to just
I
explain.
have some another idea. Sorry.
I like the 3 modes: full compatibility, full features as the default, no features as sort of I know what I'm doing and I'm going to selectively enable, and then a least common denominator feature set, like a compatibility mode. That just at the time of the release, it enables all the flags that were available across all of the tier 1 releases.
Right, and I think you want to give that a name. You probably want to call them mobile or portable pools or something. Emphasize that that's the goal, right? To be able to have a USB drive or whatever that you can plug into your
there you go.
OS 10 laptop and your server.
Yeah, portable pool. I guess which should be the default?
The default.
I don't think you're going to be able to get everybody to agree on a default. So I think we should assume operating systems are going to manage their own default posture. And then
I have one idea.
We make the documentation really clear on what this is for and why you would choose the portable option.
I think we can make a name of features between platforms. For example, we can create universal compatibility name and identify a list of features what can be used between platforms. For example, I want to create a pool with compatibility version feature set 1, and I can import and export this pool between the platforms. To Linux, FreeBSD, and the Lumos.
Well, I don't quite know what you said, Igor. Sorry, I kind of missed it, but at least from my perspective, I'm just going to say what I would hope for is the most optimistic for new stuff and the most pessimistic for pool upgrades. And so that means that if there wasn't a flag turned on before, it should not be on going forward when you upgrade. When you're making brand new pools from scratch, I would say let's flip on all the features unless somebody sets a mode that says otherwise.
So sorry, what
we can upgrade between feature sets. We can upgrade between known feature sets. For example, if I want to upgrade a pool from feature name, feature 1, feature 2, feature 3, and this feature name will be available on all platforms, and I can upgrade my pool on the known feature name if I want to use this pool on different platforms. This idea. We need a specified universal name with the list of features what are available between platforms while we port features to different platforms, and it will be universal compatibility name what I can upgrade if I want to use my pool on different platforms. If I want to export my pool from Lumos and import to Linux, I want to know compatibility between Lumos and Linux and use the same version of pool. With
Wait a minute. Doesn't that all the feature flags work? The only problem is the unknown flags. Like, one side's not going to know if another side has newer flags. So other than that, it should already be that way, unless I'm wrong about this somehow.
Pretty sure it is already that way.
I'm confused.
But I think that is the case. It's just,
okay.
The problem is the unavailability of certain non-overlapping sets of flags on different platforms, I think.
Okay. So we just have to resolve the unique names to something and go forward, I guess? I mean, I don't know, because as far as I knew, all the flags were already resolved at this point.
you will be wondered if you cannot import your pool on a Linux and export your pool on Linux, and you cannot import it to Lumos because feature set are different.
Well, feature set being different versus feature set labels being universal are two separate problems. Like,
Yes.
I mean,
yeah.
you can configure, like you definitely can enable a set of features which are compatible across all of the implementations. We're talking about creating an easy way for folks to select that set.
And also verify, and you want to be able to, once you've got the ability to have basically meta names for feature sets, we can also say, is this going to be compatible on this other meta name?
Yeah.
And that will be useful.
Yeah, so I
perhaps a good,
want to respect folks' time. Sorry, did you have one last point, Brian? I know you got a couple times.
I was just going to say, perhaps a good space to start would be to figure out today, in all the release versions, what is that minimum feature set? And we could just establish that as that meta tag.
So I want to respect folks' time. We're already 2 minutes over. I think this is a great discussion, both about kind of the meta stuff of what is the project, what are our goals. And it sounds like one of the big conclusions out of that is that Illumos and FreeBSD want to work by kind of going through the Linux commits one by one and pulling them over in roughly chronological order rather than project-based. And then the discussion about the cross-platform pool compatibility, I think, does someone besides me want to take this as an action item to kind of come up with some proposals and lead the discussion on this?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay. Cool, Josh. Then I'll look for your message, I guess, on the developer mailing list. And I think once we get some kind of concrete proposals out there that we can start building on, then that'll be productive.
Okay,
We'll follow along on the mailing list too. So.
And then 2 quick things. Igor asked about moving this meeting to 11 a.m. Doesn't mean that Jurgen will probably never join us, but maybe that's also always true. Are people available? You can, if you click under more on Zoom, you can do a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And then also the next regularly scheduled meeting is on January 1st. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't plan to be dialing in on January 1st. So I'm going to move it to January 8th.
It will be fine to me. Thank you for this point.
I know it's quite late for you, Igor. Thanks for joining us. I don't know how I see the results of the thumbs up.
If you click on print,
What?
They'll appear next to people's name, so you can see that check mark.
I see the check mark. Gotcha.
so we're talking about moving the meeting from 1 o'clock Pacific to 11 o'clock Pacific. So
Yeah. Only a couple people, well, a few people.
I mean, this is my lunch break, so as long as it's around noon my time, I'm in Mountain Time, I'm perfectly happy. I'm not going to complain.
yeah, I think probably folks might have particular meeting conflicts, but the time zone probably works okay for folks in United States, North America, and Europe. I think it's mostly Jorgen. Jorgen, are you on? Do you have a...
He's not on. As far as
Right. Well, I imagine it probably doesn't work very well for folks in Asia.
No.
This time already doesn't work well for them. So
Yeah, this time also is not great.
why don't we check with Jorgen and see if 2 hours earlier is significantly better